Hey guys, come on in and gather around. I've got a story I want to read to you today called Encyclopedia Brown and the Crapbag Bible Swindler by Daniel J. Sobel. A wry smile crept across Bugs Meany's face as his uncle, Darrell Swindlehart, the traveling antiquities dealer, strolled to the front of the stage of the annual Idaville Antiquities auction. A hush swept over the crowd as Swindlehart pulled from his satchel a small, ornate wooden box. He opened it carefully. The crowd was so quiet that the hinge's tiny squeak could be heard all the way in the back. With his white gloves, he reached in and carefully lifted out a dusty old tome that looked like it must have been from centuries past. Swindlehart spoke, saying, "The book I hold in my right hand is more than 1,500 years old and is none other than the oldest known copy of the Holy Bible." The crowd oohed and awed in anticipation, wondering what their neighbors might be willing to bid for such a treasure, wondering what they might be able to dig out of savings to bid for themselves. But one member of the audience wasn't so convinced. Standing in the back, Encyclopedia Brown stroked his chin and looked closely at the book. Swindlehart, still boasting about the quality of this artifact, carefully turned page after page, reading excerpt after excerpt. "People of Idaville," he declared, "I now present to you the most famous and beloved Bible verse of all the Bible verses, John 3:16. And turning the book around so they could see for themselves, he drew their attention to the large number 3 in ornate gold leaf calligraphy and the detailed number 16 next to the most precious of all Bible verses. And stone silence fell upon the crowd as Swindlehart enunciated each word. But in an instant, Encyclopedia Brown knew what he had to do. He walked confidently to the stage, strolled across, and before Swindlehart could even finish the verse, ripped the microphone out of his hand and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this man is a fraud. Officers, arrest him." Without so much as a thought or hesitation or a moment of eye contact with their actual police superior, they did just that, repeatedly batoning Swindlehart as they cuffed him behind his back. The crowd cheered with nervous excitement. But Encyclopedia Brown wasn't done. "This man has lied to the good people of Idaville. He's deceived us all in an attempt to strip us of our money and our integrity. Therefore, a simple arrest is not enough. I commission you, the people of this fair community, to pull limb from limb this swindler, and further to extend the punishment to all who bear the Swindlehart name. Let the streets of Idaville run red with the blood of the Swindleharts as we confiscate their property and dismember their men, women, and children." A cheer went up across the crowd. And for the next 4 hours, the people of Idaville did just that. Later that day, as the dust was settling, Chief of Police Brown, Encyclopedia Brown's dad, waded through the river of blood and dismembered body parts on Main Street over to where his son was standing, taking in the whole scene. "Son," he said, "great job today. But I have just one question. How did you know he was lying?" Encyclopedia Brown turned to his father and said, "It was simple. Swindlehart claimed his Bible was 1,500 years old, but chapters and verses, like the ones he showed us, did not appear in any Bible until the Middle Ages." "Well, I'll be," exclaimed Chief Brown. "You really are a great human being." The end. If you pick up a Bible, one of the first things that will stand out to you is that this isn't a normal text. It's got numbers mixed into it. They're big numbers that represent chapter breaks, and they're little numbers that represent verses within each of those chapters. And then it resets with each book of the Bible. And as we just learned from this heartwarming children's classic, that's not original. In fact, this stuff was introduced to the Bible actually pretty late in the game, pretty recently, as it were. So in this video, I want to talk about how the chapter and verse numbers made it into the Bible, and the pros and cons of them being there. I'm Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour. Here we go. I think a really good place to start with this question of how did these chapter and verse breaks get in here is to just think about why people would want them there. And to me, it makes perfect sense that Christians and Jewish people who really care about this document and who think that God is behind it and that all of these words are from God, it makes sense to me that they would want to be able to study this and talk about it in very precise terms. That they'd want a way to be able to tell somebody else, I'm dealing with this sentence from this particular book of the Bible. And so sticking numbers on it, well, that's just what we do with things. We catalog it when it's important and we want to have it organized up. So that we would want to organize the Bible into chapters and verses makes sense, but how we did it and how we pulled that off over time and how we landed on what we ultimately landed on, that's a bit of a story. So here's the way it went down with the Old Testament. The Jewish scriptures, or what Christians call the Old Testament at the time of Jesus, didn't have chapters and verses assigned. What they had were clever little marks to break it up into chunks that fit with the calendar year. So what we see in the Septuagint and some older versions of the Old Testament, and then some versions of the Old Testament that come right after Jesus, are creative uses of like little colons and line breaks and spacing to give hints and cues to whoever was going to be doing this public reading that you read this far at this time, then you maybe wait a week, and then you read this far to the next break. And it broke out neatly in 1 year and 3 year cycles. So it's not very hard to decipher and decode that, but there was no chapter and verse breakdown that really caught on in the Old Testament scriptures until much further down the road. So you get to the Middle Ages and you've got now this academic scholarly class. The university is a thing now. You get these mega genius, multilingual rock stars who do nothing but sit around and study the Bible. There's a lot of weight behind that in the Middle Ages because that kind of scholarship informs what Rome does, and Rome informs what all the countries do. So it's an important thing, and this document has maybe even some ramifications it shouldn't have in the way it's affecting the state. Well, these academics are like, look, it's imprecise. It's really hard to say what we mean to say or point to what we mean to point to. And so there's one guy in particular, a dude named Stephen Langton, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury in the early 13th century. Archbishop of Canterbury means he's like the guy in charge of all of Christianity in England. And Langton puts chapter numbers, chapter divisions through the entire Bible. There are some other dudes at the same time who were working on the same kind of project, but they weren't the Archbishop of Canterbury, so I guess their divisions didn't win out, and this guy's did. Well, it catches on, but it's still not enough, because just looking at what's right here in front of me, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is this long. So I can get you close by saying 1 Corinthians 11, but there's a lot of stuff in there. So there's this desire to have a greater level of precision. Enter this dude named Stephanus. He's a printer from Paris. Talked about him in a video that I did about the Reformation, about Bible text work a while back. He's an important guy. He's innovative when it comes to the Bible. He's not making new Bible, but he's trying to make the Bible more user-friendly. And frankly, he's trying to sell copies to fund printing more stuff. So his son, writing, a few decades after Stephanus has died, tells this story about Stephanus being in a rush to meet a printing deadline. And so on horseback between Paris and Lyon, his son would have him, sitting there scribbling in the rain, trying to just hastily throw verses on everything and carve it up so that this edition could get out and get to the public. It's probably not really what he meant, but it's just become kind of a fun apocryphal story over the years that's how the verses got into your Bible. Some dude was in a rainstorm and just sloppily wrote some stuff down. And on the one hand, that kind of makes sense, because when you really get into the Bible, there are some verse divisions that just seem stupid. Like we're cutting this off in the middle of a thought. We're making it so that you could extract this completely contrary idea from the actual main idea that's on either side. So yeah, maybe Stephanus didn't knock it out of the park, but what he did, I don't think was so much an attempt to make theological sense of the Bible as much as just to catalog it, break it down, and make it something that other people could apply sense to later. Whatever the case, Langton's chapter divisions and Stephanus's verse divisions win out, and pretty much without exception. If you got a Bible in front of you right now, or even if you have a Jewish Old Testament Torah in front of you right now, you're using these chapter and verse divisions. So like it or not, all of our Bibles have these chapter and verse divisions in them, but the question is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, on the side of it being a good thing, obviously we've discussed how this catalogs the Bible and makes it easy to study, debate, process with other people. Awesome. Additionally, if Christians think that this is written by God, it would make sense that they would want to memorize it and internalize it and reflect on it. And I think the verse divisions make it easy to come up with a plan, easy to figure out, well, I should memorize this much. And so I think that has been a benefit. Additionally, these verses create something of an accidental brand, stuff to latch onto, numbers and rhythms. John 3:16 has a certain ring to it, right? And you see it at football games in the 80s. You see it on Tim Tebow's eye black and things like that. It's something that you can quote enough and repeat enough that somebody might get curious as to what it's about. And so it can be maybe a mechanism by which truth from the Bible gets communicated to other people. I don't know, maybe I'm just making stuff up. But on the negative side, the most obvious problem to me is that you're creating divisions where divisions weren't originally intended to be. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and argue that we should all go burn all our Bibles and get ones that don't have verse numbers in it. No, I think the verse numbers are probably a necessary thing, but we have to read beyond the verse numbers or else we're going to come to weird conclusions. Sometimes the chapters match the rhythm of thought of the author really neatly. It's a clear and obvious mental break here. We should be on to the next thing. Psalms is a great example. It's a collection of songs. Obviously, each chapter gets one song. Super simple. Proverbs, kind of the same way. Like, oh, here's a bunch of truisms and sayings. Well, it makes sense that we would assign a verse to each one of those sayings. Simple. But what about when you get to the middle of a big dramatic narrative event? How do you carve that up? Well, it's not so obvious. There's a chance that you might cram a chapter break into a weird place. And even if that chapter break made sense to the narrative brain of people in, say, the 13th century, I mean, you're talking pre-Braveheart here, or made sense to the narrative brain of people in the 16th century, I mean, again, we're talking like Shakespeare, barely era here, well then, how do we know that those rhythms are going to make sense to the narrative brain of now? Isn't there a chance that these chapter divisions would reflect how stories were told back then, but not at all how we tell stories now? See, we have to work to overcome that, or I think it's really easy to just misread the Bible and feel like, hey, we nailed it and it fits. So these things are a good cataloging cue, but they can really send us to weird places. Example, Colossians chapter 2, verses 20 through 22. I'm going to read these three verses in which Paul is clearly making the argument that you don't need to reject everything in the world and live like paupers and lay on beds of nails to follow Jesus. He's calling for a more moderating approach. It goes like this. Since you died with Christ to the basic principles of this world, why, as though you still belong to it, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. That's verse 21. These are all destined to perish with use because they're based on human commands and teachings. Such regulations have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Okay, clearly he's saying that this rejectionism isn't such a good idea. And that maybe if there is some weird stuff going on with you people who he's writing to, it's stuff that's the level of the heart. And you need to do stuff that's the level of the heart to address it. Oh, no problem. But what about verse 21? It just says, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. But if we wanted to skip all those other verses, we can completely flip the meaning of what Paul is saying here. Well, we could probably find 8 billion other examples of the same kind of stuff happening in the Bible. The point is, you understand context and how it works. You've said things that someone has taken out of context, and you've been horrified at the meaning that they have ascribed to you based on that out of contexting. Likewise, it's not too hard to peruse the internet and find ourselves horrified by the stuff that people can do with the Bible, saying, but I'm quoting a verse, and they do quote the entire verse. But come on, that's not how it works. Obviously, if we want to read it well, we have to look beyond these numbers, use them as something that might help us keep track of where we're at, but ultimately remembering they're not inspired, the notes aren't inspired, the maps aren't inspired, the little chapter headings or the portion headings that say, this happened here, that happened here, is not inspired. The only thing that Christians believe is inspired is the original text. So if you bear that in mind, you're probably going to get a little bit ahead of the game in terms of understanding what this actually means. The point of this video is simple. The chapters and verses in the Bible aren't inspired. They came after the fact. This is when they showed up, 13th century, 16th century, respectively. And if somebody comes to your town and tries to sell you guys a Bible that has that information in it, that predates those chapters and verses being put in, you'll know to dismember them. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. We'll see you soon.